Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the second panel of our conference, which is on the migration of Central Asians during the colonial rule, by which probably means the 19th and early 20th century. So the first presenter is Dr. Hakim Elnazarov. He is the head of the Central Asian unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
In this presentation, I will try to explore the migration and displacement of Central Asian mountain communities during the colonial period. Migration and mobility have been important characteristics of socio-economic and political situations of Central Asian mountain region. Like the rest of Central Asia, the region experienced intense movement of people and blending of various cultures, languages, and civilizations. It's known that one of the Silk Road passed through the Pamirs, which also is an indication of extensive communication, trade, and cultural exchanges between people of the region and other civilizations. Despite harsh climatic and geographic conditions, the Pamirs and Hindu Kush mountains attracted and sheltered people of various ethnicities, religious affiliation, and political orientations who escaped slavery, warfare, court intrigues, ethnic cleansing, religious persecution, and natural disasters. The patterns of inward and outward migration varied and changed over time. There are, however, various views on how the hills and mountains were populated. One theory which gained currency in European Oriental studies in colonial period was the idea of Central Asian mountain region being the cradle of Western civilizations. And Gabriel Bonvalot, the German explorer who visited Central Asia in 1890s, mentions that what adds to the interest of visiting a land, the configuration of which is so strange, is that it is inhabited by races of the most diverse types, and we ourselves believe to have had ancestors there. And the opinion prevails among men of science that first of the human race felt in this country their first needs and aspirations, and that our earliest ancestors found their way from there to the West. This idea prevailed among many Europeans who visited the area. The ethnographic studies of the mountain communities initiated by European explorers during the colonial period attest to the diversity of people in the mountain region. Now, one example of that inward migration to the Pamirs is described by Alexei Bobrinskoy. Bobrinskoy, in his fundamental work, The Mountain Dwellers of the Upper Panj, notes that the knowledge about this community was largely created from written sources of foreign nations, or theories and hypotheses stipulating the origins of Aryans or Indo-European nations and their possible homelands in the highlands of the Pamirs. Bobrinskoy set himself the task of recording and studying the narratives of the local residents about their own history and traditions, which makes his publication extremely valuable from ethnographic and historical perspectives. Bobrinskoy maintained that the inhabitants of Wakhan, where he conducted his study, were not homogeneous, but represented a diverse group of people who migrated from far and near lands, including Khorasan, Badakhshan, India, and Iran. They supplanted the past inhabitants of the region known as Siapush, those who were in black clothes, the Kafirs, sort of. But this diversity does not exclude the fact that the people of the region were holders of some of the ancient cultures and languages which are believed to be the remnants of Scythians, Bactrians, Sogdians, who inhabited the vast Central Asia at various times of history. Now, in the eve of the colonization, Pamir principalities sort of were formed of Wakhan, Rushan, and Shognan kingdoms, or Khanate, or midships they were called. These were semi-independent, multi-allegiance kingdoms spread on both sides of the river Panj. The population was governed by secular and spiritual authorities. Usually the spiritual authority was in the hands of Ismaili, because the population was mostly Ismailis, and but they were ruled by Sunni, so the secular rule was in the hands of the Sunni. The inhabitants of the region were identified according to their geographical location, so like Shughni, Rushani, Wakhi, but they were referred to collectively also as the Tajiks of the mountains. The Pamiri and Badakhshani, what we today call them, is a recent development and emerged much later. So population of the region between the 1885 and 19, from the scarce materials we gained from different sources, was that in Rushan kingdom there were approximately 3,000, in Shognan 4,000, in Wakhan 2,500, and these were the data which a British officer named Elnazarov, who visited the region in 1885, collected in Shognan and Rushan, and Bobrinskoy, who went about 5 years later, collected the materials on the Wakhan population. So that's approximate number of the people coming close to 9,500 or so. So there was at least less than 10,000. The Afghan onslaught and occupation of Shognan, Rushan, and Wakhan continued for at least 10 years, from 1883 to 1894. Since early 1880s, when the presence of colonial powers, namely Russia and Britain, became increasingly visible in Central and South Asia, Shognan, Rushan, and Wakhan experienced devastating onslaught of the Afghan army. In an attempt to control the semi-independent kingdoms in the north of its borders, the Afghan army conquered the countries and or the kingdoms, and the occupation of these principalities was carried out with violence, enslavement, and displacement of the people from their homeland. The people of Shognan and Rushan repeatedly rose against the invaders, but every time the uprising was suppressed with more brutality than before. Russian officer and explorer Bronislav Gramchevsky, who witnessed the flee of the Shogunanese, described their plight as follows in 1889. When the news of advance of Abdulmamad, that's the ruler of Afghanistan, and his approach to Shognan spread across the country, the entire population first resettled in the right bank of Panj River and then slowly moved up through the Rund Valley. Some 2,000 families, mainly elders, women, and children with their property, were moving towards the lake Yashik Kul, intending to move partly to the Russian territory, while a bulk of them were seeking refuge in Sarikul in the Chinese territories. The Afghan troops reached a group of refugees near Shikul and dealt with them with unheard brutality. Women were raped in front of their husbands and fathers, and children were thrown into fire. As mentioned earlier, Elnazarov, who visited the area a few years earlier, provided an estimate of about 4,000 population of Shognan. According to the count of Russian explorers, more than half of the population of Shognan and Rushan left their home and migrated to China and Russian territories. The Afghans' onslaught forced at least 80% of the population to migrate and find shelter in neighboring countries. Now that's an approximate movement of migrants during the Afghan onslaught. We see that the population of Rushan, Shugnan, and Wakhan moved in the direction of China, and some of them from there also moved to Fergana, to the Russian territories. But China was their main destination. Later we know that even from Darwaz, which was initially part of the Bukharan Emirate, but Russia agreed with British to give that to Afghanistan. There was also migration of people to the south of present Tajikistan. So in the Russian territories, the refugees mainly settled in Fergana Valley, and some family there still remember their origins and the ancestors coming as refugees from Shugnan. A large number of refugees settled in Chinese territories. While some segments of the population looked at the resettlement as a temporal move, the prolonged Afghan occupation in the country meant that most families have settled permanently in China and Fergana. The refugees not only carried with them part of their belongings, they also took with them their traditions, practices, and even the names of their villages and homeland. Today, one can still find settlement in Chinese territories having identical name with those in Shugnan of Tajikistan, such as Shokhdara. A valley in Shugnan of Tajikistan is also a name of a settlement in Tashkurgan country in China. Before the arrival of Shugnan refugees, the area were inhabited by people mainly Sarikulis and Wakhis. These people shared the same linguistic and cultural affinity with the people of Shugnan, Rushan, and Wakhan, and thus it was easier to find the shelter among the people of the same faith and cultural practices. And you have heard earlier in the presentation of my colleagues how still religious peers, for example, settled in China, and they still call themselves Shugnanis. So the question which I also want to explore a bit more, why did the Afghan occupy these semi-independent states, and what provoked them to conquer these khanates who maintained their relative independence for centuries? These conflicts were largely rooted in geopolitics of the time, the colonization of Central Asia by the Russians, and the Indian subcontinent by England, and their subsequent rivalry in Central Asia, which is also known as Great Game. The advance of the Russians to Central Asia attracted the attention of the British since the middle of 19th century, but its threat to the Britain-India was taken more seriously when Sir Henry Rawlinson, the high-ranking officer of British East India Company, wrote a memorandum in 1868 in which he pointed out, "What we have to fear most was not the invasion of India, but the disturbing influence on the people and princes of India, which would follow were Russian to come to contact with our possessions." After carefully considering the memorandum, government of India sent a dispatch to the Secretary of State in which it recommended to approach court of St. Petersburg to come to an understanding of the design and projects of Russia in Central Asia. The dispatch also suggested to inform Russians that they cannot interfere in the affairs of Afghanistan or other states which are contiguous to frontiers of British India. The negotiation between the two governments evolved around Afghanistan and defining the country ruled by Sher Ali, the Afghan ruler. The British defined the boundary of Afghanistan as the Oxus from the point between Kirki and Khoja Saleh eastward to Panja and Wakhan, and up to the point where the range of the Hindu Kush meets the southern angles of the Pamir Steppes. The British definition did not satisfy the Russians, who objected to Badakhshan being included in the domains of Sher Ali, as the country in the north came to contact with Kokand, Bukhara, and Kashgar. Therefore, in the hands of powerful and ambitious rule of Afghanistan would endanger the tranquility of the state. Wakhan was dependent of Badakhshan, and if Sher Ali could really establish his authority in Badakhshan, it would extend its power to Wakhan as well. That was the Russian objection. The other problem was the idea of river forming a boundary was erroneous because Oxus consisted of several streams and it would be impossible to decide which was the main one. The British government maintained that Sher Ali inherited Badakhshan from his father, and after temporary deflection of ruler of Kunduz and Badakhshani, again acknowledged the Amir as their sovereign. The British and Russian have not included Shoghnan and Rushan in Badakhshan, which were also spread across both sides of the Panj River. These principalities still remain uncharted territories, and the general perception was that they were located on the right bank of the Panj River. The Russian objected, claiming that giving Badakhshan to Afghanistan would give the Amir a prestige and claim to Wakhan, and that would further increase his appetite for conquest and disturbing the peace in Central Asia. The British tried to prove that Wakhan was always politically and geographically part of Badakhshan. But the main concern of the British, which they admitted in internal communication, which of course they didn't share with the Russian, was that if Wakhan is not included in the territory of Badakhshan, that Russia might have complete and exclusive command of the great line of communication between Western Asia and China. Moreover, Sir Rawlinson maintained that road from plains of India to the great plateau of China, Turkestan, follow the Chitral Valley from Kabul, superior road. So a foreign power in possession of Wakhan would not only command the great trade route from west to east of Central Asia, but would also hold the gates of India. So that was the main concerns of the British. In January 1873, the British government conveyed to Russians that His Majesty's government came to conclusion that Badakhshan and Wakhan are part of Afghanistan. But the British government committed itself to impress upon the Amir to abstain from aggression and demonstrate peaceful attitude. The Russian ambassador in London agreed to the frontier line suggested by Lord Granville, though the agreement was in somewhat vague terms. When the Amir was informed of the agreement, he was not satisfied with this arrangement, the Amir of Afghanistan, claiming that it is impossible for Russians to remain always firm on their negotiations. He asked for more money and arms, and if necessary, the aid of British troops in case of invasion. What followed after agreement? The advance of Amir of Afghanistan to the north to consolidate his power in Badakhshan and other semi-independent states, including Shoghnan, Rushan, and Wakhan. The occupation of the Pamir principalities continued until the middle of 1890s. The population of Shoghnan and Wakhan more than once rebelled against Afghans, but every time they faced more aggressive assault by Afghan, particularly in 1888-1889. Some authors call this period a genocide against the people of Shoghnan and Rushan. The Shoghnanese asked for help from Russian authorities in Tashkent, dispatching letters and sending their representative to Tashkent and Russian garrison, which was stationed in Murghab in the eastern Pamirs. However, while Russian officers were sympathetic to the plight of the indigenous population, they could not engage in direct combat with Afghans without authorization from St. Petersburg. The borders were clearly demarcated by the two empires, and the onslaught of the Afghans stopped. So in conclusion, we see that The 1883 to 1904 were the darkest period in the history of Pamiri principalities, which led to the migration of a large portion of the population from contested territories and left behind devastated economy in deserted lands. Second wave of migration took place during Bukharan rule, but it was not that extensive when the Russians decided to compensate the Emir of Bukhara for the loss of Darwas in the South Bank and gave him Shoghnan and Rushan, and people struggled for another 10 years before they got rid of the Bukharan. We also see some evidence of migration after the full annexation of the Pamir to the Russian Empire from 1905 to 1918, but that was during that relative peace, which facilitated life by migrants from Shoghnan to Fergana and Osh, but their number was negligible. So the main causes, which I think I just summarized, was that the inability of the powers at that time, Russia and Britain, to control the regional and local rulers in their geopolitical game. As in the case of Afghanistan, Britain, in spite of providing arms, was not able to stop the Afghan ruler from ruthless campaigns to Badakhshan. The rivalry of the two powers led to the significant configuration of the socio-political borders of the mountain communities and an intensification of movement and migration of the community in the region directly and indirectly. In Shoghnan, it took place indirectly with the invasion, with the involvement of Afghans. But if you look at the northern Pakistan, the British were actually directly involved with these communities and forced a large segment of them to move to the Chinese territories. But we don't have time to discuss it here. Fragmentation of religious structures and hierarchy in relation with people on other sides of the Panj River happened. For example, there were mentioned of 15 peers functioned in Central Asian mountain region, whose murids spread across Badakhshan, Afghanistan, Chinese Turkestan, and British Northwest frontiers. And that connection was lost. So that also triggered some migration when people who did not have access to their peers, they moved to other neighboring countries to be closer to their peers. So the whole project of demarcation of borders and defining the spheres of influence served the imperial objective of the superpowers without regard for the interests and needs of the indigenous people. Bobrinsko, who observed the consequences of the limitation, put it this way: the decision of the Russian and British empires to demarcate the region along Panj River was like drawing a border across the middle of a Russian village. The artificial border obstructs the social relations and exchange of goods and trade between the people of the same origin and faith, and adversely impact their social and economic lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakim, for such a insightful, presentation talk on the migration of the Pamiris during the Anglo-Russian Great Game, which, as we know, consequently impacted on the displacement of the Pamiris who left their homes and the division of their country into Tajikistan and, at that time, Bukhara Emirate and then Afghanistan, and also emerging the new migrant communities in the countries of the destination which they left. We have Malika Zehni, a PhD student from the University of Cambridge. Malika,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you so much. This is an absolute pleasure and joy to be here and to be presenting part of my research. I am no longer officially a PhD student, but I'm yet to submit my hardbound copy, so we're somewhere in the liminal space. But I'll be delving a little into some of the broader themes that I've looked at and would be delighted to hear any questions and feedback you might have. And we'll begin with something that is potentially familiar to a lot of people in the audience, and that is Sadruddin Aini's memoirs. In his memoirs about life in the Tsarist period in Bukhara, nominally an independent emirate but functionally a Russian semi-colony or a protectorate, Sadruddin Aini recalled encounters he had at the madrasa of Labi Hausi Arbab, a place allegedly owned by an opium addict and often referred to as Ghaibat Khona, or the house of gossip. There he met Makhdoom, the mullah's son, known for his run-ins with the Bukharan police. On one such occasion, as Makhdoom was on his way to a party, he was halted at the city gates by the police. Perceiving this as a sign of disrespect, he voiced his displeasure with harsh words. As a result, both he and his friend were taken to the police office, where they were presented before the police chief, or the mirshab. The mirshab, in response, shouted vehemently with intimidation and threats. Then, the unexpected happened. Makhdoom put his hand in his pocket, took out colorful pieces of paper, and declared, "We are subjects of the mighty Russian Empire. Here are our passports." Living in the imperial borderland of the Russian Empire, Makhdoom seemingly cruised not only a space where borders seemed to be all around, be it between the protectorate and empire proper, administrative provinces, or different empires. His experience also revealed another border that he seemed to navigate quite skillfully, and that is between a subject and an alien, a native and a foreigner. Crucial in Makhdoom's story is how his papers symbolized and protected him, papers in the presence of which the proud Mirshab immediately turned pale, erupting into an apologetic tone, promising to arrest his foolish subordinates who dared to hurt Makhdoom. The passport, as Aini put it, altered the dynamics of the encounter. Even, as we find out, the passport itself was entirely fake. In this short paper, I'll briefly explore this concept of a paper bazaar within colonial Central Asia at the turn of the 20th century, a concept transcending a mere marketplace into a metaphorical realm where rights and allegiances were crafted and traded alongside counterfeit documents like passports and permits. This inquiry forms a much larger study examining documentary regimes and cross-border mobility within the Russian, British, and Qing imperial borderlands. It delves into what I see as korozbozi, or paper chase, a term embodying the game-like uncertainty within colonial bureaucracies. The study challenges the conventional view of bureaucracy as a static clerical entity, revealing its dynamic pulsating system of activity and negotiation, where both colonial subjects, from laborers to pilgrims and officials, from clerks to consuls, were in a chase. The heart of today's story lies in the subversion of that documentary regime, often overshadowed by the more visible aspects of colonial administration. The bazaar, as a locus of document issuance and exchange, intertwines with the histories of empires and the continuous remaking of imperial belonging. This dynamic manifests not only in the physical spaces like border checks and quarantine posts, but also in the more nebulous arenas of negotiation and exchange. While the physical border infrastructure is of particular interest, today we'll look at how passport transforms from mere bureaucratic tools to active agents, shaping the contours of inclusion and exclusion and materializing abstract notions of belonging into tangible realities. Central to this narrative is Bani Rahman's work on the document bazaar concept within the context of South Asia, which highlighted a gray market of document creators, pointing to the dual nature of paperwork as a source of both trust and distrust within colonial governance. By expanding this to a paper bazaar, I hope to question the dynamics of exchange, trade, and belonging outside the state office itself, while interrogating the matter of materiality, ownership, and crafting of a travel paper. So to whom does a travel paper belong is a fundamental question. If it contains intimate information about a carrier, why is any change made to the document viewed as a crime against the individual, not against the individual, but against the state? Think of the passports you might carry today. They are intimately our documents, but for some reason, if you make any change to these intimate documents that we own, it's a much larger crime. And this was also true in the context of colonial Central Asia, in the context of the late 19th century. And it is this dilemma that was starkly exemplified in the experience of a man named Sirgibay Mankuzov. He was a Kyrgyz man in the early 1880s who navigated the provincial boundaries within Turkestan. Confronted by authorities and requested to present his passport, Mankuzov faced arrest for forgery. His passport, accurate in identification, but overwritten on erased sections, provoked scrutiny and legal action. This incident catalyzed a broader discourse within the Russian administration there, treating counterfeit documents as direct affronts to state power. In a decisive move, Governor Gerasim Kolpakovsky deemed the native courts ill-equipped to grasp the gravity of such offenses. Consequently, all cases involving document forgery were transferred to the jurisdiction of the military court, with Mankuzev's case escalating to a charge of high treason. This decision reflected a prevailing belief in the inability of the native courts, as well as the native subjects, to fully comprehend the seriousness of document manipulation. Yet the prevalence of forgeries challenges this and unveils an alternative narrative. It suggests some level of awareness among the population of the bureaucratic system and its vulnerabilities, often to their own advantage. So in contrast to Mankuzev's unsuccessful attempt at local boundary crossing, numerous contemporaries ventured beyond further frontiers. Among them was Kurbanbayev, from the Fergana province. While his actual travel documents we cannot find, a significant artifact remains from him, and that's a signed pledge on his behalf. This pledge was a piece of small document, is a testament to the stringent imperial regulations that governed pilgrimage travel at the time, stipulated adherence to a very specific travel route. Kurbanbayev committed to using designated Black City ports, namely Odessa or Batumi, as transit points. This pledge was a requisite part of the process to secure a pilgrim passport. Interestingly, had Kurbanbayev planned his journey just a few years before he signed this document, he would have had greater obstacles to travel, because there was a pilgrimage ban, which was imposed only 3 years before his actual travel, including, which impacted the whole of Central Asia, including Fergana. The ban effectively suspended the issuance of pilgrim passports, thereby barring any Russian subjects from officially traveling to the Hijaz. Just to have an idea. Many found alternatives like the popular route through British India, which is the green route over there. Alternatively, others would obtain a document that would permit them to travel under the guise of a different belonging. The closest one would be the Bukharan Emirate, where despite being a semi-colony of Russia, subjects could obtain an emirate passport and subvert the regime. This could also mean a significantly cheaper option for them. While Russian pilgrim passport cost many upwards of 15 rubles, which was a lot of money, a similar Bukharan passport would have been around 3 to 5 rubles. A third option was subverting the paper requirements in the transit cities themselves, like Batumi and Odessa. Batumi's significance as a pivotal junction for travelers, particularly those from Central Asia, cannot be understated. The city gained a reputation for its rigorous passport control. As noted by Mirza Muhammad Hussein Farhani, a pilgrim who observed Batumi's stringent policy. Quote, anyone without a passport was sent back to where they came from. This passport-centric regime also meant that it was a favorable setting for those looking to profit from the requirement. A Batumi coffee house was one among many places. This particular coffee house in Batumi was managed by Central Asians named Haji Gizabayev and Haji Ali, who became well known among many pilgrims because they served a particular purpose as a facade of brewing hot drinks, but behind which they were issuing fake passports. In the shadows of its daily operations, it harbored a clandestine network orchestrated by Abayev and Ali, giving various forms of forged documents. These services catered primarily to those pilgrims who were either undocumented or possessed some form of flawed papers, rendering them ineligible for legal travel. Alongside Haji Ali, Haji Abayev were 2 Bukharan subjects, Yuldash and Kulshad, who were responsible for locating clients and selling them these documents. What were these papers on sale, you might ask? Most were expired Persian and Bukharan passports, although other records also point to coffee house providing travelers with Ottoman and Qing documents. These papers, often referred to scholars as un vrai passeport, or a real false passport, were particularly suitable for transfer to different individuals due to their lack of photographic evidence or any, and only containing vague physical descriptions of the original bearers, such as, quote, an ordinary nose, an ordinary chin, black hair. This ambiguity in description facilitated the frequent exchange and repurposing of these documents. Interestingly, the very agents responsible for maintaining the integrity of this travel documentation regime, that's the police, sometimes inadvertently aided this illicit trade. A common practice on ships bound for Mecca was for officers to collect the passports for inspections and then redistribute them randomly, further muddling the authenticity of these crucial documents. Indeed, Kurbanbayev, our pledge signer, might have come across this network while in Batumi. However, if he had chosen to travel via the other port city, Odessa, he might have crossed paths with a similar paper bazaar. Eileen Kane notes the booming trade of counterfeit Chinese and Bukharan passports in the city as well, in the context of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet, along with these recycled passports, there are also those who attempted to create forged documents themselves. In the late 19th century, we find a manual from Odessa, which details how to forge and create a fake identification document. The guide is titled Forms of Documents and Instructions for Compiling Forged Documents, and includes samples of passports, travel permits, and stamps, alongside meticulous directives. The latter included assessing the appearance of the traveler, who does he look more like a merchant, an official, a nobleman, and noting this down in the forged passport. The document creation process was to be precise, dictating that signatures must be made with different inks and seals and coat of arms. If the person carrying the document was illiterate and couldn't sign it, a suggested method was to first create the forged signature on a thin piece of paper. This paper would then be placed against the back of the document, allowing the signature to be seen through. After carefully aligning it in the required spot, the signature would then be traced over, imprinting it onto the document itself. This required bold writing was, quote, so that forgery would not be visible. Lastly, care was to be taken that the date on which the passport was issued did not fall on a holiday, and the revenue stamp of the required denomination was fixed and crossed carelessly and diagonally, so that the lines would transition from the stamp onto the paper. Prior to affixing the seal to the passport, a trial imprint on the paper was recommended. These practices reveal the extensive presence of a paper bazaar, a marketplace where travelers, notably pilgrims from various regions, could either engage in or observe the exchange of documents. This phenomenon presented a persistent challenge to the imperial officials, who endeavored, often in vain, to dismantle these networks. The prevailing sentiment among the imperial elite, particularly in their view of Central Asian subjects as untrustworthy and fanatically unreliable, underpinned their approach to documentation. Within this context, travel papers were expected to serve as dependable and impartial instruments of identification and control. Consequently, the compromised integrity of these documents not only undermined their practical utility, but also fueled widespread consternation among the authorities, exacerbating tension between the imperatives of imperial governance and the lived realities of colonial subjects. Conversely, for numerous pilgrims, their documents transcended mere bureaucratic function, transforming into valuable commodities within a thriving market. Upon reaching sacred sites like Mecca, Medina, or Jerusalem, some pilgrims confronted with financial hardships resorted to selling their travel papers as a means of resolving their monetary struggles. Documentation thus became a lifeline, a tangible asset that they could trade for essential resources. Some evidence from Russian consulate reports in Jeddah and Jerusalem indicates that a significant number of pilgrims from regions such as Turkestan and Bukhara frequently reported their passports as lost or traded. For these destitute travelers, parting with their passports often translated into funds for a return journey, typically via more economically advantageous routes through the Indian Ocean and British India, where passports were not mandatory for travel. From the perspective of imperial authorities, however, this trade in passports was perceived as a profound act of betrayal, raising concern about their potential misuse by spies and anti-colonial operatives. The sale of travel documents not only represented a circumvention of imperial control, but also posed a threat to the perceived integrity and security of the empire. This tension highlights the divergent perceptions of the value and function of travel papers between colonial subjects and imperial officials. further complicating the dynamics of mobility and control within these empires during the age of global paradox, with acceleration and deacceleration of mobility. In the case of Kurbanbayev, who had pledged to adhere to the established Pilgrim protocol, his travel likely brought him into frequent contact with these various paper bazaars. Journeying to and from sacred destinations, he would have eventually traversed back to his native Fergana, a region noted for its thriving cotton mills and burgeoning industries. This route not only connected him with other pilgrims, but also with a multitude of laborers, as noted in our first presentation. There are very many laborers, including from within the empire, as well as from outside the empire, interested in making a living for themselves. Among these travelers were many from the neighboring Chinese Turkestan, present-day Xinjiang, including individuals like Niaz Kasimov, a Kashgari, and a subject of the Qing Empire. In 1909, Kasimov's arrival in Fergana and subsequent acquisition of a one-year residence permit underscored the significance of imperial documentation in traversing the imperial borderlands. However, the context of Kasimov's permit acquisition in the year 1909 is pivotal, marking a notable turn in the Sino-Russian diplomatic relations, particularly impacting labor migration. The Qing government, in an attempt to regulate the exodus of Russia, dramatically increased the passport fees, leading to a notable decline in the number of laborers crossing into Russian territories. The strategic move, extensively covered in Russian media, notably impacted the labor market in Russian Central Asia. A piece in the newspaper Turkestansky Vedomosti shed light on this dynamic, noting the deliberate effect of the Qing policies on the Russian cotton industry. Despite facing these hurdles and the looming threat of expulsion for those with improper documentation, the Kashgari laborers adeptly maneuvered through these evolving bureaucratic landscapes, illustrating their capacity to adapt and navigate the shifting terrain of imperial paperwork and border controls. The newsletter pointed out that the Chinese laborers, quote, did not lose spirit. The author described the strategies employed within the paper regime due to the increased passport fees. Quote, groups of Kashgaris pooled funds to obtain a single passport, which they then used to apply to for multiple residence permits after crossing the border undetected. This one-for-all method in chasing for residence permits proved partly successful, not least due to the linguistic barriers between the Qing passports, Chinese text, and often monolingual Russian officials, or their Turkic or Persian scribes. The author of the newsletter, though noting that it's an imperfect solution, proposed the idea of forming a special committee to address such issues, rather than outright refusing entry to the improperly documented Kashgaris. Taking into account the restriction and pointing to their own paper bazaar, the author argued, we must not forget that the progress of the cotton industry and the significant inflow of funds for paper permits into the treasury are related to this issue. In the scenario, the case of Niaz Kasimov, whose permit might have been based on either his own or a collectively shared passport, points to some of the strategies employed by individuals to overcome the barriers imposed by the imperial administrations, reflecting the broader adaptation and survival within the documentary regimes. In the forging of a paper bazaar, one can see ways within and beyond Central Asia, the documentary regime was navigated while shedding light on the aspects of imperial fear and paranoia that was core to the documentary regime it attempted to institute. A subtle reminder, as noted by Veena Das, that when governance harnesses technology of writing, inadvertently sows the seed of imitation, deception, and the mimetic performance of power. This brief paper argued that in colonial Central Asia, the manipulation and exchange of official documentation within paper bazaar were central to navigating, contesting, and reshaping the power dynamics under colonial bureaucratic regime. However, a good forgery at the end of the day is an undetected forgery. And to reconstruct parts of the making of this paper bazaar, one has to follow the rules and regulations in order to notice what alternative paths and options were carved out by those on the move. Having jumped across different imperial borders, allow me just for the last few seconds to return to our initial Sadreddin Aini's story about Makhdoom. After hearing Makhdoom's adventures with the police, Aini asked him, when did you become a Russian subject? How did we not know about this? Come on, show us the paper. Let's see what this Russian passport looks like. Makhdoom disclosed that it was after a previous kerfuffle with the Mishrab that he decided to become a Russian subject for personal protection. Quote, however, to expedite the process, I did not fill the application at the Russian office, which is the political agency, Makhdoom stated. I just went to the bazaar, to the perfume seller, and bought 2 passports for myself and my friend. He then proceeded to take out 2 scraps from his pockets. Aini stated that everyone at the madrasa carefully observed the papers, which he thought looked remarkably like soap wraps. He added that at the time, expensive fragrant soaps were wrapped in thick white paper with vibrant images on them to attract wealthy customers. There was an imperial element that made these soaps passport-like. Since the product received awards from the government, they had printed the royal decree about the reward in Russian script on these papers and had also embossed the state seal on top of the decree. The story of Makhdoom's tactic paints a comical yet pragmatic picture of materiality and belonging in this period. Through Makhdoom's adaptation of such papers, Aini's account sheds light on the porosity of borders, be it physical or bureaucratic. At the end of the day, Makhdoom's soap wrap, a la passport, that freed him from imprisonment and police harassment. Thank you so much.